Hello. Parents abandoned me, uncle raised me to succeed, now I confronted my dad and proved him wrong. Back when I was a teenager, my family went through one of the toughest times of our lives. My dad, who had always been a sharp and successful businessman, hit a rough patch when his company started facing some serious financial trouble. Things got even worse when his business partner took off with a chunk of the company's money, leaving my dad with no way to save what he'd worked so hard to build. Eventually, he had no choice but to shut everything down. Now, my dad wasn't just proud of his business, he lived and breathed it. It was his dream, his hard work poured into something he believed in. Losing it wasn't just about the money, it felt like he lost a part of himself, and that hit him hard. For someone like my dad, who had always been our rock, it was heartbreaking to see him crumble. He went from being the man we all admired, who carried himself with pride and grace, to someone completely weighed down by loss. I'll never forget how those days felt dark, heavy, and full of uncertainty. My dad was no longer the cheerful man I grew up with. Instead, he was angry, short-tempered, and withdrawn. It was like the loss had drained all the energy and spirit out of him. I remember him spending entire days in bed, barely speaking to anyone. He'd only come out to eat, and even that felt more like a robotic task than anything else. His room became his world, and he seemed to lose any interest in life beyond those four walls. My mom, bless her heart, did everything she could to help him. She gently encouraged him to get out of bed, suggesting things like taking a walk or picking up a hobby to distract himself. She was trying so hard to pull him out of that deep sadness, but instead of meeting her efforts halfway, he'd lash out. I can still hear him snapping, his voice sharp and full of frustration, telling her to leave him alone. It was clear he was fighting battles inside his head that none of us could really understand. During this time, my mom became the glue holding our family together. She was a nurse at the local hospital and had always worked hard, but now she had to take on even more just to keep us afloat. The bills didn't stop coming just because my dad's business failed, and she had to pick up extra shifts to cover the rent and other expenses. Watching her juggle so much, her job, the household, and trying to keep our family from falling apart, was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She never complained, but I could see the toll it took on her. The exhaustion in her eyes was hard to miss. At home, things felt tense all the time, like we were all walking on eggshells. My younger brother, Michael, and I tried to avoid doing anything that might set my dad off. Michael was the brainy one in the family, the kid who loved school and spent his time solving puzzles or reading. Me? I was more into basketball and a few other hobbies. Sure, I kept my grades decent, but I didn't have the same academic drive Michael had. Before all this, my mom had always been supportive of both of us. She knew we were different and appreciated the effort we put into our own interests. But as my dad spent more time at home, things started to shift. He began focusing on our grades, almost obsessively, and he didn't hold back when it came to comparing me to Michael. I'll never forget him saying stuff like, "If you're not going to be the best, what's the point? Just quit school." His words stung, not just because they were harsh, but because I knew they came from his own pain. He was projecting his disappointment and frustration onto me, and it hurt in ways I didn't expect. I tried harder in school, hoping to earn his approval, but it never seemed to be enough. If my mom praised me for my grades, my dad would quickly shut it down, saying there was no reason to celebrate when they could be better. At first, my mom would stand up for me, reminding him that I was doing my best. But over time, as his comments became more frequent and cutting, something shifted. Slowly, she started agreeing with him, pointing out how much better Michael was doing in comparison. They started reminding me every single day how much better Michael was doing than I was, pushing the idea that I needed to step it up if I ever wanted to be as successful as him. My dad, in particular, seemed relentless with the comparisons, constantly pointing out how I came up short. It didn't stop there. They eventually decided I couldn't participate in any after-school activities, including basketball. They told me I needed to focus completely on my studies if I wanted to measure up to Michael's achievements. Basketball had been my escape, my one source of happiness, and giving it up felt like losing a piece of myself. But I had no choice. I traded the court for my desk and buried myself in schoolwork, all in a desperate attempt to meet their expectations. The problem was, as the rules in our house got stricter, I started to feel trapped. Home wasn't a place of comfort anymore, it was a place where I constantly braced myself for the next round of criticism or a reminder that I wasn't good enough. I felt overwhelmed, like I couldn't catch my breath. Every day was the same: study, worry, and avoid upsetting my parents. My dad kept a watchful eye on me, checking in frequently to ensure I was studying, even when my work was done. If I tried to take a break, he'd make me feel guilty, as if even a moment of rest was unacceptable. The constant pressure made it impossible to relax, let alone enjoy anything. I became so anxious around my parents that I started recognizing the sound of their footsteps. If I heard my dad coming toward my room, I'd quickly toss aside my comic book and open a textbook, pretending to study. I lived in fear of being caught wasting time, terrified of hearing him call me lazy or accuse me of not taking things seriously. That fear seeped into every corner of my life. I felt like I was tiptoeing on eggshells, never sure when the next harsh word or disapproving glance would come my way. The joy I used to find in learning or playing basketball was gone, replaced by a constant sense of inadequacy and guilt. I became a shadow of the person I once was, trying harder and harder to meet impossible standards. But no matter what I did, whether it was studying late into the night or giving up the things I loved, it never seemed to be enough. About a year after my dad's business failed, our family was still spiraling downward. My dad hadn't been able to find a job, and my mom was working herself to exhaustion, trying to make ends meet. That's when my grandmother came to visit. She must have noticed right away how much things had changed for us. We'd gone from living comfortably to barely scraping by, and it was clear the strain was taking a toll on everyone. I didn't know it at the time, but my grandmother must have had a serious talk with my parents. I think she saw how much my mom was struggling to keep everything together while my dad was still lost in his own pain. The next day, my parents sat me down for a conversation that felt different from any we'd had before. Their faces were serious, and there was a weight in the air that made my stomach churn. My dad started, his voice heavy, explaining that they'd been talking and realized they were in over their heads. He said they were struggling too much to take care of both Michael and me. I stared at them, confused and a little scared, as my heart started racing. I asked what they meant, and my dad's expression grew even heavier. He told me that my grandmother had suggested a solution, one they didn't want to consider but felt they had to. She had pointed out that my uncle, who didn't have kids of his own, had always wanted to be a father. He and his wife had a stable life, and they would be happy to take in one of us. It would ease the burden on my parents and give one of us a shot at a better future. I could barely process what I was hearing. My mom chimed in, her voice trembling, and explained that because Michael was the youngest and more academically gifted, they thought it would be better for him to stay with them. They believed his education needed to remain consistent, while I could have a fresh start with my uncle's family. Hearing this felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I was in shock, hurt, and confused. It felt like they were choosing Michael over me, as if he mattered more because he was smarter. I couldn't understand why they thought it was okay to break our family apart like this, or why they thought I was the one who needed to leave. I started crying, begging them to reconsider, asking if they didn't love me anymore. I promised to work harder, to get better grades, to do whatever they wanted if they just let me stay. But my dad shook his head, his voice steady but full of sadness, and told me it wasn't about love. He said they simply didn't have the money to support both of us. He assured me that I'd be a better fit for my uncle's family anyway. My mom tried to explain it to me like this: as the oldest, it was my responsibility to make this sacrifice for the sake of the family, especially for Michael. She said he had a better chance of achieving something extraordinary, and they needed to focus on giving him that opportunity. I just sat there, numb, trying to process her words. It felt like I was being asked to give up my place in the family, to step aside because I wasn't measuring up. Anger, sadness, and betrayal flooded through me all at once, but above everything, I felt lost. I knew life had been tough for all of us, but I never thought it would come to this, my parents deciding to send me away like I was some burden they couldn't carry anymore. I could tell this decision wasn't easy for them. My mom's voice shook, and my dad's face was heavy with regret. But their pain didn't make mine any easier to bear. They were still choosing Michael over me. They were still sending me away. I didn't even have the energy to argue. What would have been the point? The decision was already made. The day my uncle came to pick me up, the reality of it all hit me like a punch to the gut. I packed my bags in a daze, my heart breaking with every item I folded into my suitcase. Saying goodbye to Michael was the hardest part. I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face, as the realization sunk in that we wouldn't share the same home anymore. Sure, I'd see him at school, but it wouldn't be the same. We'd lose the late-night chats, the quiet moments when it was just the two of us against the world. Michael cried too, confused and hurt by the whole situation. He kept asking why our parents were doing this, but I didn't have any answers for him, because I didn't understand it either. My parents hugged me before I left, their arms heavy with guilt. My dad mumbled something about this being for the best, but his words felt hollow. I could feel the weight of their struggle, their attempt to justify what they were doing, but it didn't take away the pain. It felt like I was being cut out of the family, like they were saying, "We just don't have enough room for you anymore." When I got to my uncle's house, it was strange. I'd always been comfortable there during visits, but this time, it felt different. This wasn't a visit, it was my new home. My uncle and his wife were kind, like they'd always been, but it was hard to shake the feeling that I didn't belong. I unpacked my bags in his spare room that suddenly felt like a foreign country. The first few nights, I just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about home, my old room, the creaks in the floorboards, Michael's footsteps in the hallway. I even missed my parents, despite everything. At first, the homesickness was unbearable, but slowly, things started to change. My uncle was calm and patient, nothing like my dad when he got frustrated. He didn't criticize me for every little thing or compare me to Michael. My aunt was strict about my schoolwork, but she also encouraged me to have balance. She let me play basketball after school or hang out with friends, things I hadn't been allowed to do for so long. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells or scrambling to pretend I was studying when I wasn't. They encouraged me to join clubs at school and explore things I was interested in, not just for the sake of grades but because they saw value in me as a person. That changed everything. I started to feel more confident and motivated, and for the first time, I actually enjoyed school. I wasn't just grinding through assignments out of fear, I was learning because I wanted to. My grades improved naturally, not because of pressure, but because I had room to care again. Michael and I still saw each other at school, and we stayed close. He'd tell me about what was going on at home, small things, like how my mom started making his favorite pancakes on Sundays. Sometimes it hurt to hear about the life I was missing, but other times, I felt relieved. Life with my uncle and aunt was different in a good way. There was less stress, more support. Their home started to feel like mine in ways I didn't expect. Looking back now, I can see that moving in with my uncle was a blessing in disguise. It wasn't easy, but it forced me to grow in ways I might not have if I'd stayed. I found parts of myself I'd lost under all that pressure. By the time I graduated high school, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. When I got accepted into my dream university with a partial scholarship, I realized how far I'd come. I'd made a life for myself, one that felt like it belonged to me, not one shaped by someone else's expectations. My uncle was over the moon when I got accepted into university. He didn't just congratulate me with words, he went a step further and offered to cover the remainder of my college fees. That generosity lifted an enormous weight off my shoulders. My aunt, ever the thoughtful one, planned a small celebration for me. It wasn't extravagant, but it was intimate and full of warmth, with close family and friends gathered around to toast to my success. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen and appreciated. My parents came to the party, but their reactions were far from what I had hoped for. Instead of showing genuine pride or excitement, they seemed distant, almost indifferent. At one point, they casually remarked that Michael might end up at an even better university in a few years. That comment stung. This was supposed to be my moment, a time to celebrate my hard work and accomplishments. Yet, instead of allowing me that, they brought the conversation back to Michael, as if to remind me of my place in their eyes. What made it even harder to swallow was that I never saw Michael as competition. I wanted him to succeed just as much as I wanted to succeed myself. He was my brother, and I loved him deeply. But my parents' constant comparisons and inability to acknowledge my achievements without bringing him into the equation made it clear that they saw things differently. It wasn't a competition to me, but to them, it always seemed to be. Throughout my time in university, their visits were few and far between. When they did come, the focus was never on me. Conversations inevitably shifted to Michael, his accomplishments, his talents, his potential. They couldn't stop talking about how proud they were of him. I would sit there, listening, trying to push down the familiar feelings of inadequacy that their words brought up. Things took an unexpected turn when it was time for Michael to go to college. Despite their high hopes and constant praise of his brilliance, Michael didn't get into his first-choice university. He ended up going to his second choice, a good school, no doubt, but not the prestigious institution my parents had built their dreams around. It was almost as if they had been planning to use his success as another way to diminish mine, and now that plan had fallen apart. Their frustration was palpable. They couldn't use Michael's college placement to bolster the narrative they had crafted about him being superior to me. For the first time, they were forced to confront the reality that their younger son's path wasn't as flawless as they'd always assumed. Oddly enough, I didn't feel any satisfaction in seeing their disappointment. If anything, I felt bad for Michael. He had always been caught in the middle of their expectations and their need to compare us. I knew he must have tried his best, just as I had, and I hated that he was now feeling the weight of their disappointment. Over the years, my relationship with my parents became more and more strained until it was nearly non-existent. They rarely called, and I stopped making the effort to reach out. After graduating, I accepted a high-paying job across the country, a decision that felt risky at the time, but one my uncle and aunt encouraged me to take. That opportunity turned out to be life-changing. It allowed me to save money, make smart investments, and build a solid foundation for my future. 4 years ago, I was promoted to a senior managerial position at a major corporation. The pay raise was substantial, and it allowed me to embrace a lifestyle I'd only dreamed of before. 2 years ago, I reached a milestone I never thought possible. I bought my own home. It was a dream come true. While I haven't settled down with a family of my own yet, I've chosen to focus on my happiness and enjoy the fruits of my hard work. Through it all, I never forgot my uncle and aunt. I stay in touch with them regularly, sending gifts for their birthdays and holidays as a small token of my gratitude. They believed in me when no one else did, and I owe so much of my success to their unwavering support. Michael and I have remained close despite everything. Last year, he called me with some troubling news. He had been laid off from his job at a tech company due to the economic downturn. Since then, he'd been working on a business venture with a friend, but things weren't going as planned. When he asked if I could invest in his business, I didn't hesitate. I didn't need to see the business plan or analyze the details, I said yes. Michael is my brother, and supporting him felt like the right thing to do. Despite everything we've been through, I'll always have his back. I could see how difficult things had gotten for Michael, and there was no hesitation in my mind about helping him. Whether his business succeeded or failed wasn't important to me. All I wanted was to show my brother that I had his back, especially when he needed it most. Fortunately, his venture has started gaining traction. While it hasn't fully taken off yet, it's showing promise, and Michael has repeatedly expressed how grateful he is that I believed in him when no one else did. Knowing I could be that support for him is more rewarding than any financial return. This year, my family organized a grand celebration for my grandma's 75th birthday. It had been years since I'd seen most of them, and I was genuinely excited to reconnect and celebrate together. I flew down with a mix of nostalgia and curiosity, eager to see how things had changed. Over the years, I've evolved in so many ways, my style, my confidence, my speech, all reflecting the life I'd built for myself. When my parents saw me, it was clear they hadn't expected the person I'd become. My mom greeted me with an awkward but warm hug, which was surprising but nice. My dad, however, was more reserved. He started asking questions about my work, and as I shared details about my job, my house, and the life I'd created, I could see the surprise on his face. But then, his skepticism slipped out. When I mentioned owning a house, he scoffed, making it clear he didn't believe me. That hit a nerve. I couldn't hold back. I would never lie about owning a house, I said firmly. Not everyone depends on their wife for financial support like you have all these years. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I meant them. My dad's expression shifted to shock, and before he could respond, I continued. Growing up, your lack of faith in me was crushing. No matter what I did, it was never enough. You constantly criticized me and compared me to Michael. But I'm not that little boy anymore. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I don't need your validation. The fact that you still can't recognize my achievements says more about your insecurities than it does about me. That's your problem, not mine. The room fell silent. My dad looked stunned, clearly unprepared for me to stand up to him. I took a deep breath and added, and for the record, when Michael needed help, I was the one who invested in his business when no one else would. Maybe you should respect the person I've become instead of clinging to your outdated view of who I was. My words were harsh, and I knew they stung, but they were long overdue. For years, I had swallowed my feelings, but this time, I refused to stay silent. Later, my mom called me, upset and insisting I apologize for embarrassing my dad. She said my comments had hurt him deeply and that I had no right to bring up his dependence on her income. I stood my ground, telling her I wouldn't apologize for speaking the truth. Update 1 for clarity: my dad never returned to steady work after his business failed. He dabbled in some freelance consulting but didn't want a traditional job. My mom has supported him financially for years, taking on the role of breadwinner while he managed things at home. Michael, for his part, has always understood my strained relationship with our parents. He never endorsed their favoritism and has been supportive in his own way. As a child, he couldn't do much to intervene, but as we grew older, he's always made an effort to show his love and respect for me. I believe my parents' resentment toward me stems from their own failures. When they sent me to live with my uncle, they likely hoped that removing me from their lives would solve their problems. Instead, I thrived under my uncle and aunt's care while their financial struggles persisted. My success must feel like a constant reminder of what they failed to provide. My uncle and aunt never pressured my parents to take me back, treating me like their own son and giving me the stability and love I desperately needed. Update 2: after much thought, I decided to write an email to my parents. In it, I poured out everything I had bottled up over the years. I recounted every moment of hurt, abandonment, and disappointment. I told them how much I had needed them as a child and how their actions, or lack thereof, had shaped our fractured relationship. I made it clear that I no longer cared about their opinions or approval because their neglect had pushed me to stop viewing them as parents long ago. To my surprise, my mom called me in tears after reading the email. She apologized, admitting that she had felt immense guilt for agreeing to send me away. She confessed that her own shame had kept her distant, as it was easier to avoid facing me than to acknowledge how much they had hurt me. While I appreciated her honesty, I told her it was too late. Our relationship was beyond repair. This devastated her, and she begged me to let go of the past so we could start fresh. My dad, on the other hand, has made no attempt to reach out, though my mom mentioned he was emotional after reading the email. Update 3: since sending that email, I've felt an incredible sense of relief. It was cathartic to finally say everything I had held inside for so long. I've continued my relationship with Michael, and he remains a source of support and love in my life. Next month, I plan to take my uncle and aunt on a dream vacation to a place my aunt has always wanted to visit. They gave me everything I lacked from my parents, and I want to show them how much they mean to me. They are my true family, and I couldn't be more grateful for them. Bye-bye.